A native Georgian, Dr. Greg Brooking holds a BA from Mercer University, an MA from Georgia College and State University, and a PhD in history from Georgia State University. With over 30 years of teaching experience at both the high school and college levels, Dr. Brooking has dedicated his career to inspiring students with his passion for history. His first book, From Empire to Revolution, Sir James Wright and the Price of Loyalty in Georgia, was published by the University of Georgia Press in summer of 2022, and he is currently working on an in-depth biography of Henry Lawrence, a prominent figure in South Carolina's Revolutionary War history. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Dr. Greg Brooking to the Georgia Archives.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. I've got a PowerPoint here. And I use PowerPoints extensively in the classroom, but I've discovered that when I'm giving a talk, I don't really tend to remember to push the buttons. So it may or may not move. If we prefer, we can have the picture, the portrait, the close-up of James Wright, which is a fantastic portrait done by Alexander Soldi, we believe, obviously in the 18th century. So what I want to talk about today is a version of how James Wright lost control of colonial Georgia in 1775 and then in 1776 when he was arrested. So without any further ado, with any semblance of normality crashing down around him, Governor James Wright desperately tried to maintain some appearance of authority. He dispatched letter after letter, imploring the ministry to provide relief. However, history had taught him that none would be forthcoming, even though he had already complained that, quote, the powers of government are wrested out of my hands. During the first week of January 1776, he complained to Lord Dartmouth that if we had proper support and assistance, I think substantial numbers would join the king's standard. If I had $1 for every time he uttered that phrase, I might not be teaching anymore. I'd be sitting home just researching and writing. But he admitted no troops, no money, no orders, coupled with a wild magnitude of liberty people gathering fast. What can any man do in such a situation? How could loyalists, he complained, be suffered to remain under such cruel tyranny and oppression? If only Britain had adequately supported Georgia's loyalists, she would have never lost the colony, and according to Wright, would have been able to also hold on to South Carolina. In short, this was James Wright's experience from the Stamp Act in 1765 to the Declaration of Independence in the summer of 1776, by which time he was in London. He constantly carped about the need for succor that never came. Such was the lot of being the governor of Britain's youngest colony. In December of 1775, a Savanian wrote that two-thirds of Georgians, supported the crown, but without protection, he warned, quote, they know it is vain to oppose the current. One loyalist had even been forced to live in the swamp, having lost most of his property. On a personal level, Wright anticipated the storm and had the foresight to appraise all of his lands and properties, since he, quote, had not the smallest doubt that Britain would prevail against a parcel of the lowest people. He wanted to be able to prove the value of his properties when the rebellion should be quelled. In early 1776, Georgia's radicals determined to press forward and take complete control of the province. The rebel council appointed 3 men to secure war material, issued orders to raise its militia, and forbade royal officials from leaving Savannah. With British ships approaching on the horizon, the council further augmented its security by ordering the arrest of certain suspected loyalists. On 13 January, HMS Tamar had been sighted off Tybee Island, 12 miles downstream from the city, giving Governor Wright hope that Georgia would soon be relieved. Rebel leaders had other plans, however, and made haste for Tandy's Tavern, a rebel haven just a few blocks from Wright's home. There they resolved to irreversibly plunge Britain's youngest colony deep into the maelstrom of rebellion by ordering Wright's arrest. That night, Major Joe Habersham, whose recently deceased father had been Wright's closest friend, volunteered to apprehend him. With ominous orders in hand, he led a small party through the chilly darkness to the governor's home. At that moment, Wright and his council sat down to dinner to discuss the town's ever-growing mobocracy. As they labored through a difficult meal at Wright's mahogany table, under the comforting gaze of a portrait of King George II, a sudden noise at the front door halted the conversation. Habersham's posse descended upon the home, rushed past the entrance guard. They entered the dining room amid loud voices, boots on wood, and a cacophony of discussion. At this moment, Wright learned what former Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson had previously surmised. Quote, "Everything in American affairs happens contrary to probability." Placing his arm on Wright's shoulder, Habersham declared, "Sir James, you are my prisoner." Without waiting for Habersham to complete his sentence, however, most dinner guests scattered for an exit. John Martindale, Wright's butler, was unable to escape and soon found himself on a ship to England. The capture of the governor proved to be the final motivation for many to depart for safer environs. One confided that, quote, "These deluded people has made every prudent, thinking man withdraw from the party." One loyalist complained of the, quote, "repeated instances of outrage" during this time, adding that Wright experienced as much ill treatment as any officer of the crown. Interestingly, the denial of Wright's liberty, in the name of liberty, prompted at least one rebel leader to renounce his oath. I think this is a crux of the situation in Georgia and any revolution. We often limit liberties in the name of liberty. And that's part of the confusing and scary thing of civil wars, of which this was one. Wright was then placed on parole, but the deeply personal nature of this rapidly unfolding civil war made that a precarious condition. As early as the summer of 1775, Georgia's rebels warned the backcountry inhabitants that, quote, "a civil war in America is begun." One Continental Army officer wrote that, quote, "the daily deliberate murders committed by pretended Whigs and reputed Tories," that is rebels and loyalists, "are too numerous and too shocking to relate." Loyalists also recognized this, one writing that the revolution honored no law, no friendship, no alliance, and no ties of blood. The Civil War in Georgia was woven into the fabric of life, and Georgians lived in constant fear from these days forward. Following his arrest, the rebel council issued a resolution requiring all prisoners to be relocated to the backcountry as soon as British vessels arrived in the river. Wright had also heard of a plan to forcibly draft loyalists into the militia and use them as cannon fodder. His lieutenant governor was obliged to conceal himself night and day in the swamps. The council's promised safety of parole seemed more dubious with each passing day, especially considering Wright's home had been subjected to scattered musket shots throughout the previous month. So during the late night hours of 11 February, Wright and 3 of his children escaped through his back door and down the river about 5 miles by land. He later justified his actions by declaring that in order to avoid the rage and violence of the rebels, I was reduced to the necessity of leaving the town of Savannah in the night. Wright bemoaned that he could avail himself of not the least means of protection, support, or even personal safety, which proved far too much to endure, compelling him to seek security. Wright's escape changed the calculus for everyone. It meant that the rebels could no longer use him as a bargaining chip, forcing them to ramp up their defenses. His getaway with his family also brought about the official end of royal government in Georgia. It also meant the loss of his estate, worth over 80,000 pounds sterling. But he did not yet know this was his fate, writing that when he left Savannah, he fully expected to have returned to Savannah within 48 hours. Such are the expectations of war's beginnings. Aboard a British vessel, Wright assured the rebels that the British would not harm the town if its ships were allowed to purchase provisions. He implored them to accept these terms, adding that he was probably the best friend the people of Georgia have. Although granted leave to return to England, he pleaded his regard for the province and people is such that I cannot avoid exhorting the people to save themselves from total ruin and destruction. His pleas fell on deaf ears. The British now understood that their only chance of procuring provisions rested on their ability to access the 24 merchant vessels or rice boats, which the rebels had quarantined. Our distress here, he wrote to General Henry Clinton, is beyond description, and I must in the strongest manner possible request your immediate assistance. With such aid again, he promised, I shall think it my duty to continue here. Without, however, I don't see how I can possibly be of any material service. Such assistance, of course, would not be forthcoming. Wright soon sailed back to England aboard the HMS Scarborough shortly after the Battle of the Rice Boats, in which the British captured much-needed rice and the rebels destroyed Wright's personal baggage, which made my job much, much more difficult. After nearly being sunk at the Battle of Goat Island near Newport, Rhode Island, the Scarborough finally concluded its hazardous voyage when it docked at Halifax in April. The governor finally arrived in London several months later in early June. 2 weeks later, he and Thomas Hutchinson attended a king's levee before dining at the Soho home of Germain's secretary, William Knox, which had become a hub for American loyalists, especially for his old friend, Governor Wright. One of Wright's daughter left Georgia in 1764 to marry William Knox in England. Unfortunately, she and a younger sister and her mother were lost at sea. Georgia had been the last of the 13 mainland colonies to officially rebel, Wright said, in no small part because of his utmost endeavors to induce the inhabitants to continue in and adhere to their duty and allegiance. Wright noted that his colony failed to send any delegates to the First Continental Congress, and in a common refrain of his, would have kept the 13th strip from the American flag if we could have got any support. Wright and Hutchinson met numerous times during the next few years to discuss the situation in America. From the outset, Wright assailed the ministry with incessant calls to shift the focus of the war southward. No official expressed himself more zealously than Wright during these years, who, Hutchinson remarked, speaks freely of past measures and as freely of his ideas for prosecuting the war. This wasn't necessarily a compliment. James Wright was no sycophant, however, and the ease with which he proffered suggestions triggered and agitated Lord Germain. Sir James Wright can be of little use at present. His ideas of military operations are most extraordinary. But Wright had been Georgia's commander-in-chief since 1761 and had successfully directed the colony's complex Native American relations. Although no military savant, he understood the situation in the Low Country better than any British minister, and he rightly gauged the pulse of many dissatisfied Georgians, significant in number and of great potential use if properly supported. Germain underappreciated Wright, often keeping him in the dark and rarely seeking his counsel. Still, Wright persisted and proved, according to historian Ira Gruber, particularly skillful in emphasizing the advantages of campaigning in the South. In February of 77, Wright told Germain that his ideas, quote, flowed from an honest zeal. Although there's little reason to doubt the veracity, pecuniary interest must also have motivated him. The rebels had confiscated, quote, 523 Negro slaves valued at nearly 28,000 pounds sterling and nearly 11,000 pounds of rice from his 11 Low Country plantations, not to mention the plantations themselves and his Savannah home, which the Telfair Museum currently resides. In a common exhortation, Wright argued that the issue of taxation alone was the casus belli. He suggested that the Crown grant a generous plan or constitution for America and a pardon for most persons. Furthermore, all taxes in America shall be granted and levied in the respective colonies and not from Parliament. He had suggested this same thing a decade earlier, and one can only wonder what might have been. Notably, these suggestions also predate the famous Carlisle Peace Commission, which offered something quite similar to the Americans. In the summer of 1778, he again petitioned Germain. He warned of the danger of delaying the shift of military operations southward because the loyalists there maintained their patriotism at their peril. He claimed that the strength of Southern loyalism and the importance of Southern trade to the empire made a Southern operation imperative. He had every reason to believe that colonists would flock to the king's standard in great numbers if adequately supported. Moreover, he said the rebels were in disarray. According to historian Paul Smith, the anticipated strength of Southern loyalists was, quote, the most important factor in the reorientation of British strategy. Still, Germain was circumspect and wanted to avoid being deceived in our expectations. He sought additional intelligence and sent South Carolina's former Attorney General, James Simpson, to investigate, and his somewhat contradictory and incomplete report somehow convinced Germain to proceed. But Wright and others warned the ministry that reconquering Georgia and South Carolina would be challenging. The British must fully commit to the plan, because no partial sufferings or temporary distresses will induce the Southern colonies to submit. This was important. Wright believed half measures would be of little service, and that loyalist support by necessity was contingent upon a real commitment by the ministry. Contrary to some popular historical narratives, Wright was correct in evaluating loyalist numbers. The loyalists could shift the war's course if adequately protected and deployed, a point cogently argued by historian Jim Pipek. Germain also had to recalculate his strategy after the rebel victory at Saratoga in New York. The entry of France into the war required the British to shift their priorities southward toward the more profitable Southern and Caribbean colonies. This in turn necessitated a reallocation of forces. Germain dispatched a most secret letter to General Henry Clinton on 8 March 1778. He outlined the plan for subduing the Southern colonies, which echoed Wright's suggestions, and he told Clinton that the power, reputation, and future welfare of this nation depended upon that contest. The reconquest of Georgia was central to this plan. Germain told Clinton that if the move proved successful, the intention was to leave those to the northward to their own feelings and make them suffer every distress which cutting off their supplies and blocking their ports might occasion. The military subjugation of Georgia would allow loyalists to return to the British standard, after which civil governance would be established. Here, Wright would return to the scene. If successful, this plan would form the blueprint for South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and so on. Abruptly on that date, 8 March 1779, Germain ordered Wright to prepare to return to Georgia aboard the HMS Experiment, commanded by Commodore James Wallace, who would soon marry Wright's daughter. Rather quickly, though, Germain began to question his decision. In a letter to William Knox, he expressed his doubt whether Wright is equal to the undertaking of governing a province under these circumstances. He may have been correct, but only in the sense that no one might be equal to that challenge. With France in the war, Britain's resources were now stretched beyond its capabilities. Aside from what might have been determined to be Wright's lack of deference, it is difficult to ascertain precisely why Wright frustrated Germain so much, especially because many of his letters, because of the many letters in which he commended Wright's management of the province in the previous decade. In her impressive multi-volume history of the war, Mercy Otis Warren wrote that the influence of Sir James Wright prevented that state from early joining the revolutionary movement. Before his departure to return to Savannah, Wright was given a lengthy list of instructions and suggestions. Despite his reservations and critical assessment of Wright's ability, Germain told the governor that his knowledge of the temper and disposition of the people would be indispensable in determining the exact course of action. Most important, perhaps, was that Germain's instructions to General Clinton heeded many of the suggestions Wright had repeatedly proffered during his exile. James Wright now prepared to return to Georgia, his home for most of his adult life. He had experienced tremendous growth during this time. He had reached the pinnacle of power. He had become wealthy beyond his imagination. He had made many friends and connections, and he had experienced significant pain and sorrow. He had negotiated with varying success several imperial crises. He brokered 2 Native American land cessions. He had been shot at and arrested, and he had fled for his life. Emotions and memories must have overwhelmed him as he contemplated this next journey, in which he faced the daunting task of restoring a rebellious colony to the king's standard. Before, during, and after the Revolution, James Wright steadfastly believed in the loyalty of most Georgians if properly supported by their own government. This true support never came, and Georgia consequently fell victim to the ever vigilant, motivated, and aggressive rebels. Although Wright would be forced into exile one last time in the summer of 1782, his final 3 years were filled with ups and downs. In the fall of 1779, he played an essential role in the British defense of Savannah, the second bloodiest engagement of the entire war. He fought desperately during the remaining 2 years to impress upon the ministry and the military the need to suppress the rebellion in Georgia before moving to South Carolina. But General Charles Cornwallis's decision to leave Georgia essentially to her own, to leave the Low Country behind, left Wright apoplectic because he then knew how the war would end. He was right. Wright left America for good in July of 1782. He spent his remaining few years advocating for himself and fellow loyalists. He died on Sunday, 20 November 1785, at his home on Fludyer Street in southeast London, and was interred in the north transept at Westminster Abbey, which is incredibly hard to find if you go there now. Took us and some docents about 30 minutes to find it. His death, however, was reported on both sides of the Atlantic. The most thorough of these reports was the Morning Chronicle and London Advertiser. I'm going to read that to you, and I'm going to read the one from the Georgia Gazette. On Sunday last died Sir James Wright, Baronet, late governor of Georgia in the 71st year of his age, as he presided in that province for 22 years with distinguished ability and integrity. It seems to be a tribute justly due to his merit as a faithful servant of his king and country. Before the commotions in America, his example of industry and skill in the cultivation and improvement of Georgia was of eminent advantage, and the faithful discharge of his executive and judicial commission was universally acknowledged by the people over whom he presided, none of his decrees as chancellor having ever been reversed by the king or parliament. Under all the difficulties which attended the latter period of his government, his spirited conduct in defense of that province was singularly manifested. In italics, his loss is deeply felt and sincerely lamented by his family and friends, as well as by his unfortunate fellow sufferers from America, whose cause he most assiduously labored to support and solicit. And the success which attended his active exertions in their behalf afforded him real comfort under his languishing state of health for some time. The Gazette of the State of Georgia was much less laudatory, simply stating, died yesterday at his house in Westminster, Sir James Wright, many years governor of Georgia. Thus, after having dedicated more than 2 decades of his life to the province of Georgia, overseeing its rapid economic growth and geographic expansion, James Wright's life was reduced to a hollow afterthought. Thank you.
In Wright buried at the gift shop. I mean,
I've heard, yes. When we went in 2019, it was not under the gift shop.
the carpet's what we meant. Just
Yeah, it wasn't even under the carpet at that point. It was just so poorly visible. The etching was nearly gone. We had to get paper and do the pencil over it to get a good feel for it. But it was really right, probably 15 feet from the entrance, but nobody knew where it was. So it was hard. I know Mary Bond Warren, I think, said that she had the greatest difficulty getting to it.
I think they put it back in the Westminster Abbey tour.
Oh, did they?
I think somebody got that done.
Nice.
Don't quote me on that. I have it.
Hey.
How do you answer for people who may not be into Revolutionary War history or colonial history, the so what question about Wright?
About James Wright?
Yeah.
To me, James Wright is incredibly instructive. I prefer to write about history and to teach history from a bottoms up perspective. And in this case, although he was at the hierarchy of Georgia power as the colonial governor during the war, he is part of one of those left behind. The loyalists, often getting short shrift in history since then for obvious reasons. They lost. He's also really important as a Native American discussion regarding his involvement with them over 2 decades, his negotiating 2 important land cessions for Georgia, which certainly shifted the course of Native American history. He was, in his relations with the Native Americans, pretty progressive for the time period. He thought that English treaties with the Native Americans should be adhered to properly. In the sense that what we say we're going to do, we should do. Of course, we know that that's not the course. And then most importantly and most frustratingly for my research and for my book is the 523 enslaved Africans that he employed on his various plantations. In the book, there's a decent amount of a decent conversation, I think, about the paucity of evidence regarding him as an enslaver. We don't know much. Much of what we have about his running of plantations, which he seemed to be pretty involved in, and his treatment of his enslaved property is not really there. Everything that we have comes from his loyalist claims, in which he really just simply they are commodities. He lists them by name, by age, sometimes by job skill. But we don't know anything really about what happened on those plantations. Everything that I wrote about that, I kind of couched in that this is much of its supposition based on those around him and how they interacted with their property and their plantations. We do know that he tended to, he bought his enslaved clothing from London, and he preferred it to be of a better variety than the common variety of the clothing for the enslaved. But I mentioned that could be because he cared more for them. It could be because he wanted them to be more ingratiated to him for better clothing, or it could simply be because it might last longer. And and it was just an economic decision, and there's just no way of knowing. The one interesting clue I have about that is in his will, he left money for a servant of his named Sarah. And we can't be certain exactly which Sarah this was. He mentions 2 of them in his loyalist claims. But he said that she had been a great servant of his for years and years. And after his death, he provided for a 10-pound annual annuity and asked for his executors to find housing for her in London. So so what I think is a good question, especially for my high school students when we talk about this period. But this is the formation, the unanswered questions and problems from the Revolutionary era we still deal with today. Yeah, good question. Thanks. Hey.
He's considered one of the most skilled early governors. How was he viewed during his lifetime?
He was very popular in Georgia.
Yeah, but I mean,
he got in. He was not a fan of the of 2 of South Carolina's colonial governors, Thomas Boone and the Lieutenant Governor James Glenn, who operated as governor for years. He seems to have been someone valued by the ministry, but also someone I think that it came through in this presentation that maybe spoke too freely of his suggestions. So I think, again, valuable, but maybe sometimes a pain in the neck.
does he have living descendants?
No. I think they.
No, we agree. Yeah, they're nobody named Wright, surname Wright, well, actually our descendant through one of his, female descendants. A lot of people claim the wrong information, but there are some people just not know. I did a whole, on behalf of Greg's project, I did a whole, memo on genealogy. And, so there are some people out there, but the wrong people claim descent. The people that really do descend probably, they may have a clue, but they're not out there telling them. Greg, one question. I know Wright came to South Carolina as a young person. So how many other colonial governors do we know that actually preceded their being nominated colonial governor in their states and colonies?
You mean, not of British origin?
Yeah, they were not.
They were born in America?
Well, they grew up in America, were
Right.
more claimed to where they lived than being right out of London coming over.
I don't know that number. It would certainly be a small number. And Wright would be at the kind of the forefront of those who lived in America the longest, that were still able to achieve that kind of an appointment. He came to Charleston when he was 9 years old. And so he lived in Charleston from the age of 9 in 1725 all the way to 1757 when he went to Britain as South Carolina's colonial agent. Then he came back to Georgia for 20 years. So
It must have helped him to sort of know the terrain as opposed to.
I think, I think that was one of his true advantages. He always argued to Georgians that he always had their best interests in mind, but that, as the obituary said, he was a faithful servant to king and crown. And that was his first duty. Georgians were his second duty, but he considered himself one of them. Like his story is a story of kind of tortured loyalties between colony and country. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking to his popularity, because you mentioned that he felt that he knew the pulse of people in the Low Country. So I would take that to me, not to me, but was he not considered an outsider? And how did he become so, what made him popular with the people, or that he felt like he knew the people?
That's a good question. I think, going back to Ken's question and statement, I think the fact that he lived so long in the Low Country, those are, 9 years old and above. Those were his formative years. And his father was the Chief Justice of South Carolina. And so, and an enslaver as well. And so, in the Low Country, that kind of power and the relationships that come from that, from his father, then through him, and by as a teenager, he was acting as temporary provincial attorney for Attorney General for South Carolina, temporary and all on and off before he took the job officially. But he had so many connections, and in Georgia, his primary goal seemed to be to improve Georgia's economic situation. It was a fledgling colony in the 1750s, just after the king took over control. And so I think he was most popular with the merchants and with the planters. They viewed him as one of them. But when the Stamp Act hit and Wright enforced the Stamp Act, and he was pretty successful in that, that's where it started to change. As a lot of Georgians, even some that still liked him and still kind of allied themselves with his at least economic policies, they started to see there's the British part of it. It makes sense.
Still British.
Yes, yeah. He's like one of us, but not quite one of us. That's a good question. Does that answer that for you?
Yes. And
Okay.
a follow-up
Yes,
question
ma'am.
about his wife and daughters being lost at sea. Was that, or is that accurately documented? Because that seems kind of
Yes.
questionable.
Yeah,
We went through all that.
that was a difficult hunt. And Ken was part of that, along with the late great Mary Bonder Warren, who was a fantastic genealogist and transcriber of letters. There's one newspaper article that mentions that ship being lost at sea in 1764, and that's in the book. There are letters from James Habersham to William Knox in London, who's waiting for the daughter to come so he can properly court her. There's letters from James Wright, asking the ministry, have you heard from the ship yet? Unfortunately, that's it. He spent several months around the time of discovering that the ship was indeed lost with James Habersham, who had recently also lost his wife, and they kind of mourned together, if you will. And there are a couple of letters from others, discussing how terribly saddened James Wright was. But there's nothing in the extant record from him about this. And I think that's because his personal letters were lost in the Battle of the Rice Boats.
And he never remarried.
Never remarried, which then I wrote a short blog post years and years ago about the servant that he took to England with him and then left that annuity in the will. Just musing. Is this a Thomas Jefferson type situation? And there's no answer to that. But he never remarried, and he, which is impressive in a sense, because he had young children when she died, and he raised them perhaps along with Sarah. Who knows? Yeah, who knows? Yeah, great questions. I love those.
One thing about the ship, back then, when you got on the ship, if you were certainly an officer or one of the higher up ranks, you wrote a will, and all those wills were probated.
Yeah.
That verified that there'd been
They were actually on the ship.
Mrs. Warren tried to get the files from whatever the British Naval Archives is called,
Right.
and they were under reconstruction or something, and they never would, and so we don't know. There could be a file over there that never has been retrieved. It probably could be found now, but it was just one of those things.
And I've got diagrams of the ship. It was the Approve that was lost at sea. But there are, I searched diligently on the newspaper records and on Google and Google Books, and that ship is just not mentioned very often. Yeah, so.
There are records of other people.
When Mrs. Wright it was like today taking a freighter where there's a little room for two people.
Mhm.
It was a military ship. It was not a passenger. It was a military ship. So she and the daughters probably got a room just because they were the governor's family. It was not a passenger ship as far as we know.
And we do know that she was on the ship. The Georgia Gazette reported that when the ship left, that the ship carried Lady Wright and her daughter. As it turns out, there were two daughters on that ship, although it had always been reported that she just lost one daughter and his wife, but there was a younger daughter along as well. Yes.
You kind of touched on this with your last answer, but can you talk a little bit about just the process of writing the book, like how long the research took, and what's your most valuable, resources that you found?
The process was long. This is my PhD dissertation, and I stumbled along. I wanted to write about the Revolution, and my master's thesis was about a Continental Army officer from Maryland. I spent a lot of time in Baltimore and Annapolis for that, and it's expensive. And so I wanted to do something closer to home, and I found Governor Wright in some books I was reading, and there was nothing really written about him except some articles. And so that's the criteria for a dissertation, is something new. So I started researching and writing that in 2011. The dissertation was finished in 2013. Then I went back to really focusing on teaching and didn't think I was actually going to turn it into a book. But my wife, about 2017, 2018, really convinced me to do that. And so from then, during spring breaks and Christmas breaks and summer breaks as a high school teacher, I really spent a lot of time fixing it. I wrote the dissertation pretty quickly, knowing that if I wanted to fill in other things, I could do that with the book, but I wanted to graduate. And so I finished the dissertation. For the dissertation, I went to England, found some good stuff there. Went to Washington's Crossing, the David Library several times. Of course, I've been here dozens and dozens of times. A lot of the colonial records of Georgia are unpublished, for which I am not grateful. I spent hours and hours and hours photographing every single page of those unpublished volumes so that I can make a PDF out of it, and then do the research from home. So it was a long journey. I hope this next journey with Henry Lawrence will be shorter. I've now got some better ideas as to how to organize. Everything seemed scattered when I was in grad school, as you're trying to teach and trying to your classes done and then researching. And I was raising 2 young kids at the time. I think now I have a better handle on how to approach organization so that I can really tell a fully complete story of Henry Lawrence, which I think is long overdue.
Your book actually came out this past summer.
Yes, 24.
There's the biographies on Henry. I know I've read at least one.
There is one biography of Henry Lawrence, came out, David Duncan Wallace, old historian from South Carolina, and professor in, I think at USC Columbia. He wrote a biography during World War I. 25 years ago, David McDonough wrote a comparative biography of Lawrence and Christopher Gadsden, who grew up as young friends and then broke apart during the Revolution. But it really focused just on the Revolutionary period and how Lawrence was kind of considered a moderate revolutionary and Gadsden a very radical revolutionary. So those are really kind of the 2 books that really focus on him in any degree whatsoever. Many, gosh, probably a dozen dissertations, but just the 2 books. Yes.
You talked about all of the research that you had to do. So my question would be, of all the information that you found out about Wright, what was the most one fact that was unexpected or fascinating in your research?
I think the thing that was most fascinating to me was the discovery of Sarah in the will.
Oh.
I mean, honestly, there was so little personal information, private information about who Wright was, because again, I think the letters were destroyed. And so this was again, something I can't really dive into deeply because there's no record, but just that nugget in the will, Sandra Bowling from here transcribed his will, which if you look at a copy of that will, you would never be able to read what it was. I don't know how she did it, how that works, but that was a real neat discovery for me, as was kind of learning about just the ability to negotiate dual loyalties. And how he navigated that throughout his career. The one thing that he really struggled with, and this is a bit off topic from your question, was he was an 18th century conservative, and he could never understand revolutionary sentiment. He just couldn't understand it. Why would you take this risk? Everything is good for you. And in a lot of ways, I mean, a colleague of mine teaches AP World History yesterday, and he came to the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and he was doing a Revolutionary War activity with his kids and having them look at primary documents to determine if the war was revolutionary or was it conservative? And I could argue both, but I really tend to think it was more conservative than revolutionary as it replaced British aristocrats with American aristocrats. But back to I think the discovery of Sarah and trying to track down the Sarah in the listings of his enslaved property and his loyalist claims it was an interesting thing to try to grapple with.
Okay.
Yeah. 𝘗𝘰.
What was the most frustrating or disappointing aspect of the research?
The personal letters. I mean, what got me into history as a young kid was the fact that these people we read about are people. And I couldn't really get to the bottom of that person. Certainly I know him better than anybody on this planet, but I don't truly know him. I'll get to truly know Henry Lawrence, I think. He's got 16 volumes of papers, so that's going to help. And his writings, I mean, I already know much more about. He was a true family man, a very emotional, connected father and husband. And James Wright, I've got a feeling that he was a very, very much a family man. I mean, his loyalist claims are riddled with things about taking care of his sons and his daughters and getting a military commission for one son. And he wants to make sure, and he spoiled them. In one of his letters to 𝘍𝘬𝘰𝘮, he says, as they're struggling as loyalists and outcasts in the war, that his children are not accustomed to living the way they are, right? They're used to better things. And so he seems to maybe have doted on them, but I just don't know. And I hate that. I hate not getting to really get inside his head. So that was the most frustrating. I do. And now, some of them don't ask me what I'm supposed to be showing you. It's been a long time. I've never used the slides. I gave a talk at the Society of Cincinnati in DC a couple of months ago, and they wanted a PowerPoint, and I put one together. I didn't use it like I didn't use it here because I'm just not thinking about that. But here is the 𝘓𝘬𝘪𝘳 𝘠𝘪𝘐 portrait. Wright was, from a very young age, a member of the Masons in South Carolina. He did not join the Masons when he came to Georgia as governor because he thought it might be inappropriate for the governor to be involved in that. Not that it was a bad thing, but that it might, conflict with his duties. Low country rice plantation. This is a picture actually of Henry Lawrence, who was a close friend of Wright when they both lived in Charleston. In fact, Wright sent one of his sons, Alexander, to work with Henry Lawrence as a merchant apprentice. Lawrence wrote back at some point later saying, "I don't think this is for him." But Lawrence was a very, very fastidious. He had the true Protestant work ethic, and he did not take laziness or any kind of lack of focus in Alexander Wright as a young man may have exhibited that. Now I'm forgetting who this is. This is probably Lachlan McIntosh and 𝘙𝘦𝘭𝘶, if my memory serves correct. They were in a duel in 1777 when Wright was trying to get the British to move their strategy southward. He wrote that now's a good time. They're fighting in Georgia. Two revolutionary leaders have a duel, and the duel was on one of Wright's plantations. This is escaping me. That is not Henry Gates. Okay. And then wow, I'm lost. There's McIntosh. That's Lord North. This is John. That's Otho Holland Williams, who I mentioned as I didn't mention him by name, but in the paper, he was the one that said that, talked about the pretended loyalists and reputed Tories, and it was just a free-for-all in the Southern backcountry during that Civil War and how difficult it was. This is the Approve ship. This is William Knox, biography by Leland Bellett. Very well written, very much a part of my research because William Knox was going to be part of the Wright family, but was also politically well connected and important to Wright. That actually, I think, is Lord North. This is Thomas Hutchinson, a young Thomas Hutchinson, former Massachusetts governor, which we know so much about during the early years of the Revolutionary crisis and everything he endured and sometimes caused for himself. There's George III. Here is the Loyalist Commission's report that Wright was the president of the American Loyalists as they submitted a report to Parliament. Interestingly, Wright received the single largest Loyalist compensation plan from the British government. It was not nearly valued as stated at roughly £100,000. And they gave him, I think, ultimately awarded him £33,000 for all of his properties and such. And then they gave him a continued £1,000 annuity for the rest of his life, because that was the salary he earned as colonial governor. Of course, he died, pretty quickly at a moderate age of 70, 71.
Pension, and he died.
Yeah, that pension worked out well for the government. But those are the slides. And again, I didn't think I was going to go through them again, so I hadn't looked at them since November. I'm sorry that I got a few faces confused.
Putting together PowerPoint presentations, I know, well, maybe I don't know, but I personally agonize over what pictures I'm going to use, what the meaning is, what meaning I'm trying to convey. And the one of the rice plantation.
Yes.
What were you trying to convey to the audience with that?
This, like I said, this is coming from the discussion that I gave, the talk I gave in Washington, D.C., which is much longer and covered more material. And I spent some decent time talking about what we talked about a little bit in the question period. And this is simply just kind of giving a visual of the scenes in the Low Country. When I discussed Low Country slavery or Chesapeake slavery in my classes, it's much more involved. Like you said, the images matter so much to the students, and when you're trying to portray information to them, and so much more in depth, much maybe less homogenized and safe, if that makes sense, than this image is. Much more personal, I guess, in class. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought of. That's something.
Yeah. Anybody else? You guys have been great. Thank you. I really appreciate it, especially coming after a reschedule. Thank you.